Professor Bai, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
You are most welcome.
The National People's Congress just held its big meeting in Beijing, and you've just come from that. You're part of the CPPCC. What was the atmosphere? Were people optimistic, full of energy and courage, or were people fairly, downbeat and disheartened by the COVID-19, virus?
This is a very special year. I don't think people are downbeat, but at the same time, people also realizes that we face a lot of tough challenges ahead, and we are ready to work hard to confront these challenges. So I think people are determined.
So there's a sense of resolution or resolve, as you say, determination.
Right.
But
Yes.
but not want of euphoria.
No. Most people are fully aware that how much challenge we face.
That comes to the economic questions.
Right.
Are we looking at a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery? I mean, we have all the letters in the alphabet soup now, to describe.
Right.
Yeah, but China came into the pandemic as one of the earliest, and many are saying that we should look to China now to see what it's going to be like to come out of the pandemic, particularly, of course, economically. The initial figures look quite good, actually, out of China. April and May figures are not looking too bad at all.
Yeah, it's if I have to choose a letter, I would say it's a asymmetric V.
What does an asymmetric V mean, sir? What does the asymmetric mean, Professor Bai?
Right, the drop was very fast. The recovery is fast, but not as fast as the drop. Because we face this very special challenge that even though we have the pandemic somewhat under control and the resumption of economic activities have been quite good. However, the worldwide, the economy is still in very bad shape. So we face very weak external demand. That is a big problem for us.
So you're saying the bottom has been reached, but we're not seeing a rocket bounce up?
We are bouncing up, but not as fast as the drop.
Because if we look, very unusually, the NBC did not give a forecast for GDP growth this year, which is, of course, it has never occurred in the history that no forecast was made. So that sounds as if, that they're being quite cautious and rather pessimistic possibly. But yet, on the other hand, the People's Bank of China, they have not changed interest rates, which some analysts say means that the People's Bank of China perhaps is a little bit optimistic. It thinks that the economy does not need that extra injections of cash.
Well, it's the reason we are not giving a forecast of the growth rate. I don't think it's because of disagreement among policymakers. Rather, it's because of most people agree that there is a lot of uncertainty ahead, and nobody can predict what's going to happen in the second half of the year.
Sometimes when you face a crisis, it can be a good point to shake up an economy and make things very different. Do you think we're going to see that in China, that we're going to see this as an opportunity to change, let's say, the big state-owned enterprises, break them up much more into smaller units, or to give the SMEs a greater chance? Because we could see that a lot of the healthcare sector SMEs really, came forward when it came to the pandemic.
Right. I think one good thing that may come out of the pandemic is that people and enterprises are using digital technology much more. Actually, this conversation is an example of that. And the digital technology will help a lot of firms to become more efficient. And also, it generates a lot of data that helps financial institutions to make sounder decisions when they make finance available, make funds available to enterprises. So if there's any silver lining of this terrible experience, I think that's it. It's quicker adoption of digital technology by a lot of people, and that may help future efficiency gain.
In 2019, the Chinese economy was already slowing.
Right.
We were looking at numbers for growth which were probably already at about that 6 or 7. It wasn't, the US-China trade war, a certain amount of coming out of the various bubbles for property and so on, had taken a certain amount of toll on the Chinese economy. These readjustments.
We have achieved very high growth rates for over 40 years. And the level of economic development is so much more advanced now than 40 years ago. So given this level of economic development, it's not very realistic to expect double-digit growth. At the same time, we also have this demographic trend that the people in the working age, the number of people in the working age is shrinking. So it's natural for economic growth rate to come down. Then, as you mentioned, we also face all these challenges from the external side, the US-China trade disputes, the uncertainty created by these disputes. It's very challenging for enterprises.
Are we just going to go back to the trade dispute, or possibly will it become even more intensified, and that's going to hurt the Chinese economy even more?
This is, again, very difficult to predict. I think the uncertainty does not come from China's side. It's mostly the US side. When you face this situation where one person or a small number of people make the key decisions, and this person or these number of people are not the most predictable people in the world.
You're referring to President Trump?
Well, yes, President Trump is hard to predict. He takes actions that are unconventional. And given the US election coming up, I think there's a strong need for domestic political purposes that he and his team take some actions that they think are politically advantageous. So this makes any prediction very difficult. In terms of uncertainty, I'm not very optimistic. I think the uncertainty will be there at least until the US election. Hopefully after the election, uncertainty eases a little bit, but then again, it's hard to tell. But at least before the election, there's going to be this high level of uncertainty that
or at least until November.
Right.
Why take the decision then, let's say, for example, with regard to Hong Kong, why take a tough decision now to make these changes in status when perhaps the Chinese economy really needs Hong Kong to be thriving? It's injected a great deal of uncertainty into Hong Kong's future, and Hong Kong as a very vibrant economy or part of China's economy.
I think the Chinese economy, as well as the world economy, needs Hong Kong to be stable. So then different people may have different opinions about how to achieve stability. So that's up there for debate. However, I think stability is very important.
So you're saying that from Beijing's perspective, at least, it's Hong Kong's stability and via these new legislations that will create greater stability.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area, so I cannot say I can represent Beijing's perspective. I think some people believe that there are certain ways to achieve stability, but I also firmly believe that stability is very important and rule of law is very important.
Let's look at some of these longer term objectives. One of the things that the pandemic has done is it also given some changes to the trade flows that we've seen. For example, the ASEAN countries, the countries in Southeast Asia, suddenly became China's largest trading partner in February and March because of the fact that so much else was being rechanneled. Do you think we're going to see this continuing, or is it just a one-off blip due to the pandemic?
During the pandemic, global value chain was disrupted. People start to think whether we should make preparations for these possible future disruptions to global value chain. As a consequence, they will try to source their inputs from their home country more than they did before. So that's going to be a change. However, I don't know how long that will last. Global value chain has its economic reasons. It's more efficient. I think trade will still be there, and the world is going to be different, but I don't know how different the world will be.
A lot of people are saying, you're right, that the world is going to be different, but different perhaps for 10% maybe doesn't really have that big an impact. But are you talking about a difference, let's say, of 40 or 50%? Like, let's say, for example, where a product will no longer be even made in a country any longer. An iPhone will no longer be made in China. It's going to be made in Vietnam now. Is that the kind of big shift that we're talking about?
I don't think we'll see such sudden and big shift. Say all the manufacturing go back to the home country and you don't outsource at all, and global value chain stops entirely. I don't think that will happen, and I don't even think it will be, say, 50% of the global value chain will be stopped. Maybe 10%, 20%. Maybe I'm too optimistic.
But won't it make it very difficult for China now to make that adjustment also that it wanted to do in the past? And that is to become less trade dependent and more consumer dependent. In other words, that the average Chinese citizen would go out and, to put it bluntly, shop more. Because now Chinese consumers look as if they're going to be rather cautious given what's happened over the last few months.
I think the pandemic left a psychological scar on consumers' mind. I think there are still a lot of people who are uncomfortable going to restaurants, and tourism is hurt a lot. I think the recovery is going to be, at least international tourism is completely stopped now. So there are still some inertia when people react to the change. However, I think in the medium term, if the pandemic it comes under control worldwide, I think consumer psychology will quickly recover.
If we look also at China's investments, a lot of money is being pumped into the system, rescue packages for various, or support packages for various industries. But you've been somewhat cautious about that. You say that you shouldn't be pumping money into all infrastructure projects. So what are the projects you think that don't deserve to be supported, or shouldn't have, that kind of, who don't need that support?
We have been making a lot of infrastructure investment in the last many years, especially after 2008. In 2009 and 2010, we implemented the so-called 4 trillion yuan stimulus package. The actual spending was much more than that. And so if you look at roads, for example, highways, we have built a lot of them. And some of them are very efficient. It helps to reduce the cost of transportation, making transportation faster. But there are cases where the usage is very low. And we don't want to waste our resources by building these bridges that go nowhere, roads that leads nowhere.
But what about those who say that you need to have these roads because without the roads, then you won't have any trade taking place? In other words, it's a kind of, the layman's argument that if you build it, people will come.
Right. That happens in some places, but not everywhere. When you don't have the resources there, the endowments there, that makes it possible for you to make products that can be traded on the international market. Even if you have the roads, you cannot create trade. So you just need to be selective.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative then? Are there parts of that may be what you are implying, that it may not be such a brilliant idea because we don't really know how much trade is going to channel into that?
However, I think the pandemic makes the Belt and Road Initiative more difficult. We are working with a lot of other countries, and these other countries are being hit very hard by the pandemic. However, I think there's a lack of infrastructure in a lot of developing countries. I think building more infrastructure there is going to be very good for these countries. So I think we need to balance the benefit to these developing countries, to China, and the risks that Chinese investors face.
Final question, Professor Bai. Next year, do you agree with the IMF that China is going to see a 9-point-something growth rate?
well, 9% growth rate, that prediction is based on the assumption that this year the economy is not going to do very well. So that's starting from a lower base of this year, then next year it's 9%. So that's possible. For I think if you look at the growth rate between the second quarter of this year and the first quarter of this year, if you analyze it, it's going to be huge because the first quarter was really, really bad.
Terrible, yes, of course.
So that's possible, but it's don't. I hope people are not fooled by that number because it's based on a low base.
Professor Bai, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you.